Well, in Unit 5, we begin our discussion of practical applications of curriculum development and design. And so far in our course, we've covered a lot of theory, a lot of philosophy, and there's a lot of material here that can really be overwhelming. But as we move into the final stages of our course, we look at some practical ways in which we can apply that theory and those philosophies into the everyday routine of teaching and instruction. And so the next several units here will be an enjoyable part of our study in which we can actually take and apply some of the things that we've been learning in the theory and the philosophy sections. Also, there's several other things to consider when it comes to implementing curriculum planning. We have, of course, time management. What kind of materials will we use as we implement our curriculum? So there's many other things to establish, to think about, and we have to, of course, appreciate and understand that there is no perfect curriculum. And as much as we want to tweak and refine and adjust our plans and our ideas about what we want to teach, there comes a certain point where we kind of have to close the book and begin teaching it. And so this is really where we're headed here the next several units of our class, is that understanding that there's no perfect curriculum, but we want to do the best we can to put in a good plan in place and then carry that through. One of my favorite people to read about, General George Patton, said a good plan executed violently right now is better than a perfect plan executed later on. And so we hope our plan won't be violent, but we do want to have a plan and to be able to go forward with it instead of just kind of flying by the seat of our pants, which is what many educators do. Many teachers, unfortunately, get sucked into that in our busy schedules. We want to have a plan in place in which we can plan to be successful. And so we're really moving from a theoretical foundation into a practical aspect of the course, and we want to talk about how we can implement the ideas that we've been discussing so far. And so now let's move into some of our planning and some of the ideas that we have to be able to implement the things we've been learning so far. Von Brummelen in our text talks about many things that we can do to go ahead and incorporate our plans into the classroom. He provides a list here of 7 things that we need to take into consideration when it comes to making a yearly plan. And I won't take the time to read through all these necessarily with you. These are in your Von Brummelen text on page 144, but his main idea here is we need to have a target. We need to remember what it was that we set out to do. What was our plan from the beginning? And if we're shooting for nothing, then we're always sure to hit it. So we don't want to be that kind of an educator. We want to have a plan. We want to consider the mission of our school. How does what I'm doing on a daily basis fulfill that mission? What are the expectations that are set on me by my administration, by my parents of the children that I'm teaching, and then, of course, by my own students? And am I fulfilling those expectations? Making then a yearly plan is a way that we can establish fulfilling some of those expectations. And that really is the focus of this video, is establishing an idea for a whole year kind of plan. And we want to then take that yearly plan and then break it down into units in which we can then begin to choose some of our resources and then take some of those plans that we've made and implement them. And then, of course, finally looking back and always evaluating, how did I do? When we have the ability to self-evaluate, the willingness to self-evaluate and look back on the past and ask ourselves, how did I do it implementing those plans, then that is the mark of a true educator. You've moved from being just a teacher to being a real educator, taking a look back and seeing how you did. And so Von Brummelen has an interesting statement he makes in his text. He says, textbooks tend to cover rather than uncover. And I know that I, as a teacher and educator, feel the pressure that textbooks sometimes give me the feeling that I have to cover everything. And there's so much information there that I want my students to learn. And so the tendency is for all of us to kind of take that textbook and attempt to cover everything that's in it. And this can be a real danger, and our author exposes that danger and the tendency that we have to try to bury our students in content, because we want to do a good job. We want to give them a good education, and yet sometimes textbooks can give us the pressure of feeling that we have to cover every single thing in it. What I want to cover today in our video is a plan that I have implemented in my own classrooms to avoid that pressure to feel like I have to cover the entire textbook. And this is not necessarily the intent of the textbook authors, that we try to cover every single jot and tittle of every chapter in our textbook. A wise curriculum author, a textbook author, is going to give a teacher a lot of resources, a lot of information to be able to cover. We much rather have too much material than too little. And so a textbook publisher is going to make sure that their book has plenty of resources and information in it. And yet we as teachers can sometimes feel like we have to cover everything. And so the problem becomes that we stifle our classrooms, we stifle the education of our students by attempting to cover it all and do all of it. And so one approach that some people have is to push through as far as they can through the textbook. Just go, 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 go. Try to get through the whole textbook. Try to get through everything. Whether the students are with us or not, that is irrelevant, unfortunately. We're pushing through to the end, trying to cover as much as we possibly can. The other extreme would be then to go so slowly, trying to get everybody to absorb all the information that you never make it through the majority of that content. And so there's two extremes there that are both dangerous. And the worst case scenario, the worst thing that we could do really for our students would be just kind of take it as it comes. We don't want to just not have a plan. We want to have a plan to be successful. And yet if we just kind of walk into the classroom each day and open the book and see what's next, we've really kind of failed our students by not planning a wiser course of action than that. And so what we really want to have is a good balance between making some good coverage throughout the school year and giving our students a chance to absorb that information and to really understand it. But we have to plan for it if that's going to be the case. If we're going to be successful in giving our students what they need, then we have to make a plan to do that. And so today I want to spend some time talking about how I personally handle this in my classrooms and how I have taught this plan. So what many educators do is they take what I would call a linear approach to teaching their classes. And this is basically where we start at the beginning and we push through as much as we can until we come to the end of the school year. And this is a challenge because we all as teachers want to give our students a good experience. We don't want to skip over things. No one wants to be the teacher that robbed their students of a good education. And so it's normal for us to take that book and and say to ourselves, isn't this what students are expected to know within a year? I mean, this textbook publisher wrote this book. Isn't this what kids are supposed to learn in the whole year? I need to race through it and get through as much of this as I can because I want my students to get a good education. That's great. But we have to remember this, that there is enough in that textbook so that you will never run out of information, never run out of material. And so we need to break ourselves of the mentality of thinking that we can cover it all and that we can cover every page and every activity and every problem in that book and every question. And breaking ourselves of that linear approach is a real challenge. And yet if we don't break our minds of that, we're setting ourselves up for real failure. I want to kind of talk about that a little bit and the problems that are associated with just trying to start at the beginning and going as far as we possibly can in a linear approach to our curriculum, our textbook. And so if you take the linear approach, it's really kind of a race to the end. And whether the students come with me or not, that's kind of irrelevant. I'm pushing through. I'm going to get through as much of this content as I can. And I hope they all get a good education, but really I'm more interested in getting through my book than I am in them absorbing it. And that's obviously a dangerous thing. And so if you take this approach, really, we'd be lucky to get through probably 75% of that book. And that can be feel us at the end leaving like we failed for not finishing the book. And then the next year we'll push even harder and faster to cover even more of that book. And I would suggest to you that this is the system by which most teachers operate, but I would suggest that it's a broken system. And we need a new way to think about how to approach our curriculum and our textbooks because this system, although it's easiest for us just to push through in a linear fashion, is not what's best for our students. It's not equipping them to learn and to absorb what they really need to know and to enjoy learning in the process. And so really the main question I want us to think about in this video is, what can I leave on the cutting room floor? I, as the teacher, as the educator, as the professional in the room, I have the obligation to decide what is important. And what are the things that I really want my students to learn about my subject, about my course, my class, that if they don't get this, they are going to be in the hurt. So there's a lot of material that really can be left out, and if we have time to cover it, great. We can always circle back on it and go over that. But I want to suggest to you a different plan that's a little different from the linear approach, and that is what I've called the survey approach. Now, many educators who take the linear approach think they've accomplished a lot, and they probably have. After spending 9-10 months in school, if you have taken a linear approach, you've chances are covered a lot of material, and yet I would suggest that oftentimes we have not covered what really was important. Let me explain what I mean by that. So a textbook writer, a textbook publisher, is presenting the scope of a subject. Let's say, for example, algebra. I teach math, and I've taught algebra for many years. And so our textbook publisher is providing us with a book on algebra that's showing what students should be exposed to within a school year. And so we really fail them if we don't expose them to all the large concepts within that scope. So for example, let's say that my algebra book has 18 chapters in it, and I take the linear approach and I push through as much as I can, and I only make it through 14 chapters. Well, I've actually failed my students by taking that approach in the first place, because they are now missing out on the major concepts that are in chapters 15, 16, 17, and 18. So I've actually kind of failed them by not making them aware of those broad concepts that they need to be at least aware of. And so students will be better off covering 75% of every chapter than just 75% of the book. Let me say that again. Our students will be better off having covered 75% of every chapter in the book than by covering 75% of the book. Now, they have the rest of their lives to learn the rest of the information out there. But if our students are not aware of the broad concepts that that course is trying to introduce to them, then they are limited in what they can explore in the future. And so my job as an educator, really in the K through 12 setting, and I suppose to some extent in college as well, is to expose my students to these broader concepts that they can use as a foundation to then explore further later on if they so desire. And so really, as I think about this with a pyramid, and you see the diagram there, our job really is to establish this foundation that sets up our students for success going forward and gives them something to build on. And our job is not always necessarily to make that pyramid really, really high, as much as it is to make it really nice and wide for our students. And so we want to be able to survey the material. That's why I call this the survey approach. Give students a chance to know what is out there. And remember the statement. It's very simple. Broad is better. Broad is better. Our students will have the opportunity to explore in more depth and detail later on. And I'm not saying we shouldn't dive deeply in middle school and high school. But our goal is really to cover the broad concepts, expose our students' minds to those broad concepts so they can explore them a little bit more later. And so continuing with the survey approach, really our job is to then establish this foundation and make that pyramid nice and wide. Not always go as high as we possibly can, but we want to give our students an opportunity to see what's really out there. And so how do we do this? Let me kind of break that down for you. I'm going to use the illustration again of Algebra 1, and I'm going to purposefully select the lessons and the sections, if you will, that I leave out. I am planning to leave some things out, and that's okay. I'm the professional educator in the room. It is my job to make that decision and to make sure that my students are exposed to the big concepts, and I may have to choose to leave some of the other concepts, the other activities, the other lessons out. And that's the tough decision that we have to make, but it's what's best for our students. And you'll often see that in your textbooks, as you get through a chapter, the tail end of the chapter, if you will, has some additional information, some things that can be left out. It doesn't mean that you want to get into a habit of just cutting everything out. Obviously, we want to give our students some meat and potatoes as they're learning, and yet there's also a understanding, I believe, from a curricula standpoint, that there are many extras that can be left off if needed, if need be. And so, as you think about curriculum, curriculum writers often write in a spiral pattern. In other words, they're overlapping. They are circling back on themselves, on the concepts from year to year. And so students will always have an opportunity to see some of those concepts later. And I, as an educator, as a teacher, also have the opportunity to circle back on myself. So let's say I choose to leave a few lessons out or a few sections of a chapter, if I get to the end of the year and I get extra time, I can always circle back on that information. And so I want to show you here a chart that I've made that illustrates the survey approach. And this is a chart that I have made at the beginning of the school year. And again, I'm purposefully planning here what I'm going to leave out. My chapters, there are in this illustration, there are 14 chapters. And remember, my goal here is that I would much prefer to cover 75% of every chapter than to only cover 75% of the book. If I went through in a linear fashion through Algebra 1 with 14 chapters and just taught straight through, I might get to chapters 10 and 11 by the end of the school year. If I went through and did every single lesson and every section of every chapter, I might make it to chapter 11. Well, then my students don't know anything about chapters 12, 13, and 14. I've really robbed them of that solid foundation upon which they can build later. And so what I've done here is I've made a chart that shows the total sections in each chapter and then the sections that I'm planning to cover. And notice that in this column, not every chapter I'm planning to cover all the sections. I've purposefully planned to leave some sections out. I've given myself a date on which I plan to finish and the number of class periods that I intend to use for that chapter, and then I'm going to move on to the next chapter, move on to the next big concept. And so this is a plan that has helped me avoid that pressure to feel like I have to finish the entire textbook, and especially give me a plan so that I can have an idea before class begins, of how to cover the major concepts with my students and make sure they are exposed to all the real big picture ideas within that text. I hope you'll perhaps consider this as a plan that you can use as you plan your courses on a yearly approach, a yearly plan. Remember, we're planning out a whole year. I want to give them a nice broad foundation, but I've got a plan to do that. And that takes really me breaking myself of two mentalities. And the first one is teaching in a linear fashion, just going straight through the material and seeing how far I get. You know, where I end up is where I end up. And the second is the pressure to feel like I have to finish every single chapter. I don't. That's my choice. That's my option. And teachers need to take that option sometimes to be able to cover what our students really need to know. And so I'm planning then to survey the curriculum, expose my students to these broad concepts, make sure they are aware of the broad concepts and not necessarily every single detail, but that does take some planning. They've got the rest of their lives in which they can pursue those things in depth. They can take those things to the next level, build upon them. But if I'm not establishing that foundation, then shame on me for being the teacher that didn't plan ahead in order to give my students that solid foundation. You know, you're familiar with the story of Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus set out to find a new world, and at the time, explorers like him were afraid that the world was flat, and of course, the world turned out to be round. To kind of bring that illustration into the classroom context, it's very important that our students understand, especially in middle school and high school, how round the world is and how much is out there that they can expose their minds to that they can then pursue later on. This is really the foundation of a liberal arts education. It's very generous. It covers lots and lots of concepts. I think sometimes we get under a lot of pressure to feel like we have to cover every single detail in depth, and we need to make sure that we have a plan to not feel that pressure and to be able to get through the major concepts of our curriculum for the benefit of our students. And so this plan would take some discipline on our parts. It is sometimes a hard thing to do, to know when to move on and to feel like we've left out some things that were very important. But remember, there are lots of things that are important, but there are fewer things that are really, really important. And it's our job to make sure that we're giving that good foundation to our students. And so keep this goal in mind, that our job is then to broaden the base, broaden the experiences of our students, and to show them what the universe holds. And that sounds very pie in the sky probably, and a little bit grandiose, I suppose, but that has to start in our classrooms and start with our subjects. And as we're planning our curricula, we have to think of this like a pyramid and make that prism, if you will, as wide as possible at the very bottom to help my students have an understanding of what avenues they can pursue later on if the Lord taps their mind for that interest. And so get a plan in place. Don't attempt to cover everything. Let's build a broad base, and as we plan to teach a course, plan to survey the content, paint a nice broad swath through that study, and your students will be better off for it.